Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews under the deck text. On this episode of the Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on one of the commanders from the Zendikar Rising Commander Precons, Obuun Mul Daya Ancestor. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to both down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Obuun is a 3/3 elf spirit for 1 generic, 1 red, 1 green, and 1 white. He has 2 triggered abilities. One at the beginning of your combat step, and another which is Landfall. His first ability allows you to animate a land, making it have the same power and toughness as Obuun's power. This ties in with his Landfall ability. Since this deck will be Voltron, his Landfall triggers will best be used by placing the +1/+1 counters on himself. That way, any land animated during our combat is to take advantage of Obuun's power to help him take down an opponent or to spread the damage around. Obuun already gives the land trample, so that's a plus. It's just a matter of seeing how we can take advantage of a huge Obuun. Since Obuun gives the animated land trample in order to crash through, let's do the same with him. Loxodon Warhammer and Behemoth Sledge are equipment to do just that. Not only did they give him trample, but lifelink as well and a power boost too. Playing on a curve, we can get these out before Obuun and then cast him. Then, when he doesn't have summoning sickness, we can equip him with it and swing away. Rancor is another amazing way to give trample, and although it's an aura, it's a bit like an equipment since it will return to your hand if it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield. So if it's destroyed or Obuun leaves the battlefield for whatever reason, Rancor returns to your hand to be recast again for just 1 green mana. Kazakh Voltron also gives trample as well as providing an epic mana sink to really get that commander damage with it. If being an effect on a land is amazing in this deck in more ways than one, but we'll see the landfall aspect of the deck soon enough. Nylea, God of the Hunt, also gives Obuun trample, but the rest of our creatures as well. Similarly to Kazakh Voltron, she's also a mana sink that can pump Obuun as well. Her being an indestructible 6/6 once devotion is met isn't bad either. However, if we really want Obuun to get through, Rogue's Passage will do the trick. For just 4 mana and tapping, Obuun becomes unblockable altogether, which is better than trample. Again, this effect being on a mana producing land is also important in this deck because of the landfall synergy in it. You can also technically make Obuun unblockable if there aren't any creatures to block him. With Geode Rager's landfall trigger, you're goading all creatures target player controls. This means that they have to attack if possible and it can't be you. So once an opponent's creatures are turned sideways from an attack, you can then swing in unopposed with not only Obuun, but your other creatures as well to take out the table. If you want to do it with your lands as well, Morag, Fury of Akum synergizes even more with Obuun than you might think. First off, Obuun is going to be attacking a ton of times thanks to all the landfall triggers and getting stronger each time. Also, getting additional combat steps means getting additional triggers out of Obuun's first ability. So each combat step you're getting another even bigger animated land with trample in order to smash face with. And this is just with Obuun. Obviously the deck has even more creatures to be able to attack with. So Geode Rager and Morag are amazing here since they're great for going tall and going wide as well. And with sort of the Animist, yet another equipment for Obuun. Not only does it give him +1/+1, but whenever he attacks you get to ramp for a basic land. This is why the deck is running 11 snow-covered basic lands, but more on that later. Some more equipment to help out Obuun include Swiftfoot Boots and Champion's Help. If you're going to use Obuun's landfall trigger on himself, giving him Shroud is counterproductive. That's why I have Champion's Helm instead of Lightning Greaves. Either way, haste isn't that necessary, but these are both cheap ways to give him hexproof. Before we see just how often and effectively we're going to be triggering landfall in this deck, let's see how we'll be using the mechanic to its most advantageous. Since we are attacking with Obuun and potentially other creatures, we should try going wide as well as a backup plan, or at the very least, to keep up blockers after we attack with Obuun. Omnath, Locus of Rage, Rampaging Baloths, Emiria Angel, Scoot Swarm, and to a certain extent Field of the Dead each create a creature token when a land enters the battlefield under our control. You have to have at least 7 lands with different names to trigger Field of the Dead, but that won't really be an issue in this deck. It might enter the battlefield tapped, but it is a land which, as mentioned earlier, is quite important. Rampaging Baloths and Emiria Angel are straight to the point token creators when triggered. At least they themselves can serve as beaters since the Baloth has trample and the Angel has flying. Omnath creates 5/5s, which is even better than the Baloth's 4/4s, which is why it costs more. However, Omnath can also make these attackers or blockers even more dangerous since it can bolt any target whenever it or another elemental we control dies. So it's definitely a great attack and or block deterrent. Scoot Swarm is quite possibly the most busted token creator of all time, which is probably why standard players know it's getting banned. Its price dropped from $10 to $3, so now's the time to get it if you want it in your decks. Finance and standard woes aside, this insect is insane here. Once it begins copying itself, the amount of token copies you receive is exponential, quite literally. One of them makes 2, 2 makes 4, 4 make 8, 8 makes 16, etc., which is all possible in just a single turn. So if you want to include Perforos God of the Forge in your deck just in case, I wouldn't blame you, especially since Perforos also has a mana sync ability for going Y, so you can shock the table and then finish them off with combat. It's definitely a great card here. Titania Protective Argoth also makes tokens, but when your lands get sent to the graveyard from the battlefield. This is actually a secondary function of the landfall aspect of this deck. Further along in the video, we're going to see how I'm constantly bouncing and sacrificing lands in order to replay them from my hand or my graveyard to always maximize the amount of landfall triggers I can get per turn. So why not make the most of it with getting some 5/3s as well? We can also use all of our landfall triggers for card advantage. Horn of Greed, Nissa Vital Force, and Tireless Tracker help in converting our lands into potential card draw. Unfortunately, Horn of Greed doesn't trigger off of landfall per se, it triggers whenever we play a land, and that goes for opponents too. That being said, we're able to literally play multiple lands per turn, so it can at least still trigger multiple times that way. Nissa's Emblem, on the other hand, will trigger off of landfall, so any lands entering the battlefield, whether they were played, fetched for, ramped, etc., will draw you a card. Tireless Tracker doesn't draw you a card outright, but it does create a clue token which you can then cash in later for a card draw. All of this is not to say the deck doesn't run conventional card draw as well. Return of the Wild Speaker, Soul's Majesty, and Rishkar's Expertise are especially busted the bigger Obuun gets, so it is possible to not just refill your hand but overflow it. Return of the Wild Speaker is especially awesome since it can also double as an overrun effect for your non-human creatures. As always, bonus points for chaining either it or Soul's Majesty off of Rishkar's Expertise. Reliquary Tower is included precisely to be able to keep our fat hands. This might not seem all that necessary since we can just discard the lands and replay them from the graveyard later, but we do want to keep all of our responses if we drew them. Also, this effect is on a land, which is synergistic for the deck. Alright, let's see how we're going to get all of those landfall triggers. Naturally, we're going to try and play as many lands as possible. Q, Azusa Lost But Seeking, Mina and Den Wildborn, Wayward Swordtooth, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Exploration, and Storm Cauldron. Mina and Den Wildborn are amazing because not only are they a way to give trample, but they do so by bouncing a land to your hand, which can then be replayed afterwards for more value. The Dryad is also great because this being a 3-colored deck, playing with a bunch of basic lands will need a bit of help to not get color screwed. However, the most oppressive of these cards is Storm Cauldron. Yes, it allows opponents to also drop an additional land for turn. However, when a land is tapped for mana, that land gets bounced back. This can also be an issue for us, but if we have as many of these cards on the battlefield as possible, we can simply replay those lands for later on. Either way, the deck is running Birds of Paradise, Avanson's Pilgrim, Llanowar Elves, Finhorn Elves, and Elvish Mystic, as well as Soul Ring and Mana Crypt to not only get a boon out as quickly as possible, but to also help us generate mana without tapping our lands for them if we have Storm Cauldron out. It also doesn't hurt that they are potential chump blockers in the mid to late game when we're swinging in with a boon. Back to the topic of bouncing lands, Murasa Rootgrazer and Living Twister can each return lands to our hand. Granted, the lands with the beasts have to be basic, but as I mentioned earlier, the deck's running 11 basic lands, so it's not really an issue. It also balances that drawback by also being able to put a basic land from our hand onto the battlefield. Burgeoning is also another amazing card that lets us put lands from our hand onto the battlefield and pairs amazingly with Storm Cauldron. Keep in mind though that with the way it's worded, the land has to come from our hand and it's only when opponents play lands, not when they have lands enter the battlefield for whatever other reason. Either way, if Storm Cauldron is bouncing everybody's lands, you can use Burgeoning to drop them during opponent's turn when they're inevitably always replaying 2 lands because of Storm Cauldron. Ghost Town also combos amazingly with Burgeoning. You can bounce it to your hand for free whenever you want outside of your turn. Thanks to Burgeoning, you can also play it outside of your turn to keep getting landfall triggers. Ghost Town is one of my favorite lands for landfall decks, and the best thing about it is that it doesn't really take up a slot in the deck. By now you should already know what other favorite cards of mine are going to be in this deck. Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits. Not only are these amazing ramp spells in their own right to really set you ahead in the early game, but they're also amazing to trigger landfall multiple times because of that extra land. It also doesn't hurt that they can get dual type lands as well. On the topic of multiple landfall triggers per turn, not only is the deck running all 10 fetch lands, Prismatic Vista, Windswept Heath, etc., but also the slow fetch lands like Fabled Passage, Evolving Wilds, and Terramorphic Expanse. Even though these won't always guarantee an untapped basic land like Prismatic Vista does, they still get the job done. Since this deck is running 11 snow-covered basic lands, these slow fetches will definitely find something while triggering landfall twice as well. And even if those lands enter tapped, Lotus Cobra can still get us mana from them, so it's as if they entered tapped for mana anyways. However, Lotus Cobra isn't included just because of slow fetch lands. The amount of colored mana this snake can generate is ridiculous. Just look at how busted it is in the current standard environment. Even though we are playing plenty of lands, the mana boost given by the Cobra essentially doubles that, all for free. So we can cast huge things or use it to sink into Keswick Bullfront, Nylea, etc. It's definitely a busted card in the deck since we're playing lands from everywhere, our hand, library, and even graveyard. Speaking of which, let's see the graveyard strategies of the deck. Zuran Orb, Constant Mist, and Sylvan Safekeeper serve to sacrifice lands for value. The Orb and Safekeeper are free sacrifice outlets for defense, the Orb gaining us life and the Wizard giving a creature Shroud in a pinch. Constant Mist requires sacrificing a land for a fog effect is amazing. As mentioned earlier, we want to win by going tall, so if we're not left too open to horde strategies, we can just cast Constant Mists over and over again, making combat against us moot. Knight of the Reliquary and Elvish Reclaimer can also sacrifice lands, but in this case to get us more lands. While they both sacrifice a land to get us any land from our library, the Knight is limited to only sacrificing forests and plains, which isn't an issue in this deck. These creatures are amazing to get us Field of the Dead, Rogue's Passage, Reliquary Tower, or any other utility land. They can also be used to get fetch lands to then crack them for more lands, thus further increasing our landfall count. Amazing. Scapeshift functions in the same way, but it's more like a one-time use only thing. That being said, it can definitely up the landfall count in a single turn to epic proportions, and even more so if you use it to get fetch lands. Nahiri's Lithoforming is similar to a certain extent since you sacrifice X lands to draw X cards, but then you can play up to X tapped lands. So although it's not a one-to-one trade like Scapeshift, you're still drawing cards. We can then play those lands from the graveyard thanks to Crucible of Worlds, Ramanop Excavator, and Ancient Green Warden. While the first two are your standard cards for playing lands from the graveyard, the Green Warden takes it all the way up to 11. It's a 5/7 with reach for 6 mana that lets you play lands from the graveyard. Not to be outdone, it doubles landfall triggers. That's right, it makes this already busted interaction even more busted. We get twice the +1/+1 counters on Obuun, twice the tokens with our token creators, twice the mana with Lotus Cobra, twice the combat step with Morog, etc. It's just beyond busted in this deck. And to further tie in the possibility of triggering this a ton of times, Splendid Reclamation helps with that too. Similar to Scapeshift in getting a ton of lands onto the battlefield at once, playing this after sacrificing a ton of lands or right after Scapeshift itself will trigger landfall an obscene amount of times. Do it with Ancient Green Warden on the battlefield and it might just be GG. No pun intended. Further advantage to all these landfall triggers can be used for responses. Admonition Angel is a great way to O-ring target non-land permanent at instant speed thanks to all of the fetch lands in the deck. Even if we don't do it at instant speed, we can certainly O-ring plenty of non-land permanents thanks to all the lands we're dropping. However, the deck doesn't simply rely on synergistic ways to get rid of problems. Beast Within, Generous Gift, and Chaos Warp can get rid of any irksome permanent at instant speed for just 3 mana. Sure, Chaos Warp has the potential of sending you from the frying pan into the fire, but it's worth the risk in a pinch. The 3/3s created by the other 2 spells are nothing to us, so we're fine here. Force of Vigor and Deflecting Swat are potential free ways of dealing with things. The former has the potential of destroying up to 2 artifacts and or enchantments for free, while the latter can be used to protect ourselves or our things from targeted spells as well as change the target of a good spell to us. It can be used so that we're the ones drawing cards off an X spell or the ones taking that extra turn too. The deck also has ways to protect our own board state from such things with Flawless Maneuver, Heroic Intervention, Boros Charm, and Teferi's Protection. Unlike the middle two that give indestructible to our entire board state, Flawless Maneuver only gives it to our creatures, but at least it does so for free if we control Obuun, which is important. Teferi's Protection really doesn't need any explanation with how busted it is at only not protecting our entire board state, but ourselves as well. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. Besides all the lands already mentioned throughout the video, it's running all 3 dual lands, all 3 shock lands, Command Tower, Rift's Grove, and Reflecting Pool, as well as 3 snow-covered plains, 6 snow-covered forests, and 2 snow-covered mountains in case anyone is running anything that benefits us for it. The lair is even better in this deck than other decks since it also serves to bounce a land that can be untapped and it itself enters the battlefield untapped as well. As always, the dual lands aren't entirely necessary for the deck to run, and you can just as easily swap them out for the Battle Bond lands, Pain lands, etc. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Obuun Mul Daya Ancestor. What I love about this deck is that it combines Voltron with Landfall, which is an amazing ability that's easy to synergize with since every deck needs lands to play. It also has the potential of going wide just in case. The amount of shenanigans in this deck are crazy, and each time I play I find more and more interactions, which is super fun discovering as well. If you're interested in the deck list of the spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.